So we're here in Green Park now, the smallest of all the royal parks. See all the crowds coming and going from Buckingham Palace. We've also just had changing of the guard nearby here just an hour and a half ago on this lovely sunny day. But we are not here to talk about that. We're here to talk about Charles II. Although the changing of the guard actually has something to do with Charles II, since the tradition began with him when he came back in power here in this country after having been in exile for about 9 years. But we're getting a bit ahead of ourselves here. Let's just start with Green Park. This park was actually bought by Charles, known as the Merry King. He bought this plot of marshland to connect him to Hyde Park, which is way up northwest of here, and St. James's Park, which is the park directly south of this park. It was even called Upper St. James's Park back in that day. And the king had built a brick wall around the park to make it exclusively his own. His ambitions? He wanted to have royal soil all the way between St. James's Park and Hyde Park whenever he went for his morning walks or any other walks where he might entertain guests. So he never wanted to set foot outside of royal soil. That's why he bought this park. Before he bought it, it was a fairly empty park, or not even a park, it was an empty marshland. It's also been a plague pit. During his reign, actually, it was once used as a plague pit in 1665. And they actually managed to find an old plague pit here when they built the Victoria line, going from Green Park Station, that's right behind us. The Victoria line goes straight through here, and when they dug through that tunnel, in 1969, they actually discovered old bones and skulls from this plague pit from 1665. So that was about at the right depth to come down and find archaeological remains. Pretty horrifying for the workers as well. Now, here in this park, Charles would often entertain guests of his as well. Now, he was notorious for having many mistresses, so quite a few of those mistresses would have walked with him through the park. There's a road that's just on the other side of the park here called Constitution Hill. That is named after his morning walks, which he tended to call his constitutionals. So he actually tended to start his walk all the way up from where we've got Hyde Park Corner today and walk down to Buckingham Palace, or what would have been known as Buckingham House in his time. He would often go with his Cocker Spaniels ahead of him, so he loved those dogs in particular. And often be out walking with his mistresses, only occasionally with his actual wife. Speaking about his wife, there's a famous myth as to why there's no flowers growing in this park. Well, there are several myths, but one of them ascribes it to Charles II and Catherine of Braganza, who was his Portuguese wife, who infamously he had a bit of a rocky relationship with. They say that he walked through the park here with Catherine, and she decided to test his majesty one day. And she picked a flower from the park when there were still flowers here, presented it to him, and asked him to give the flower to the fairest lady of the park, which obviously meant herself. This is why I like to call him the cheeky monarch, because apparently, according to this story, he didn't give the flower to her, but to one of her ladies in waiting instead. So he offered the flower to one of her maids and said, well, I think this one is the prettiest, here you go, she gets the flower. And that, they claim, put Catherine in an awful huff. And so she went off to St. James's Palace and decreed of the royal gardeners, I want you to remove all the flowers in Green Park, and henceforth, no more flowers are to be grown here. So, take it with a grain of salt. It is a local myth, but that is one of the explanations for why they still don't grow flowers here today, because Catherine decreed that there are no flowers allowed in Green Park. There's an alternate version of this story, where it's Charles II who is caught picking flowers instead. And when she saw him picking flowers for his mistresses, because he notoriously didn't keep it secret at all, his wife was fully aware of many of the relationships on the side that he had. He didn't try very hard to hide it. But then they claim that when she discovered he was picking flowers for them here, she then made the same decree of removing all the flowers and saying no more flowers here from the royal gardeners. So as you can tell, not necessarily true, but there might just be a grain of truth to it, who knows. There's also other versions saying the park is cursed, but that's another story entirely, and that is why flowers can't grow here. So, many different explanations, but the tradition remains. It's the only royal park with no official flower beds. So here we are at St. James's Palace. Now this palace has been a secondary home for the royal family for quite a lot of its history. But it actually started out as a little holiday resort for Henry VIII and his hunting lodge. That was its original purpose, because the main action of the royal courts was down in Whitehall, where we've got all our politicians today, back at Palace of Whitehall. This was built by Henry VIII in 1536. It was initially intended to be a wedding gift for his second wife, Anne Boleyn. But this is not a video about Henry VIII, and we probably can guess what happened to most of his wives. Yes, she didn't get to see the completion of her wedding gift before she was beheaded for treason. And the king decided to make it a gift for himself. Now, how does it become relevant for Charles II? Well, Charles II was actually born here in St. James's Palace. And on the night he was born, they're shown a brilliant star in the skyline. Now, people thought that was a divine sign of good things to come, that almost get a little bit of a chosen one syndrome after this birth here. But we believe now that it was probably a supernova that people happened to see on that night. So he was born here on May the 29th, 1630, to his mother Henrietta Maria and his father Charles I. Now, it was where he was born. It was also where his father would spend his last night. So, in a bit of a twist of irony, the son Charles II spent his first night here, and his father spent his last night here before the day of his execution. And that taps into the English Civil War, which we'll get to once we get down to Whitehall. But just finishing up here on St. James's Palace, it only became a royal residence when the Palace of Whitehall burned down in 1698. Now, Charles II was dead by that time, but he had actually worked very hard to try and repair the Palace of Whitehall, but never quite succeeded. And then, of course, all of it burned down. And this became then upgraded from being a secondary home for the royal family to their official home. Had a runtime of about 130 years before Buckingham Palace, as we all know and love, was turned into the royal residence in 1837. So it's been quite a few different things throughout its history. But nowadays it is more or less, as it started out, a spare home for the royal family and the official address of the royal court. There's also a couple of ceremonies that still take place here. We've got the Accession Council up there that declare the death of a new of every monarch that passes away and who is going to be the new monarch, members of the Order of the Garter. So when our Charles III eventually has to kick the bucket, as we all do, it will be formally declared the next day up here by the Accession Council. Unless anything goes terribly wrong, Prince William then will become King William. This will also be declared here. It's also where ambassadors are welcome to the country formally here in this court. Besides that, there's a lot of hauntings stories. Not Charles II, he's not said to haunt this here, but there's many other royal figures that are supposed to haunt this castle, including Bloody Mary, who I'm sure most of our viewers have heard about. Oh, I forgot to mention, before it was a palace here, it was a hospital for lepers, for female lepers back in the day, called St. James's Hospital. And that hospital and the monastery grounds were annexed by Henry VIII. So it was part of Henry VIII's whole annexing of cloister and monastery grounds that allowed him to raise the previous building and then build his own holiday home here, basically. We're in Whitehall, right next to the Household Cavalry Guard. We are right at the site of a lot of dramatic events that would take place in Charles II's life. If we go to his early life, he had the very, well, you could say his very traumatic experience of losing his father to a public execution and being banished and exiled from his own country when the parliamentarians took over. Now that is, of course, a tumultuous event that was called the English Civil War, which began in 1642. We can actually see a little reference to one of the other big events, or the calamities of the English Civil War. If we look up at the clock up there, there's a little black smudge at 2 o'clock. And that black mark has been put there because the king was beheaded by his own parliament in 1649, just on the other side here, where we'll very soon see the bust of the king's head. So because he was beheaded right across from the road, it's remembered as a dark hour in English history, when the parliamentarians took over and ruled for about 11 years. Charles II took part in the wars that his father fought against his own parliament, but they both failed miserably and lost one battle after another, which finally prompted Charles II to flee from his own country and live in Europe for the next 9 years. So he fled in 1651, just barely managed to escape from the grasp of the parliamentarians. They say one popular story about him is he had to hide in an elm tree for several days to avoid capture and detection by the parliamentarians. Of course, when the country was ruled by the Puritans, things changed quite a lot around here, quite dramatically. Suddenly, everyone had to be a Puritan and had to obey the same laws as they did, which meant no drinking, no parties, no theatre, no football, and no Christmas. Right? All of that was banned under the Puritan reign. But as soon as Charles II managed to finally get back to his own country, and this by other Puritan generals that actually went against their own rule, he completely turned those things around. That's why he's known as the Merry King, because he reopened all those things during what is known as the Restoration period. So here we're looking at the execution site of Charles I, the father of Charles II. Now, of course, his father's execution would have impacted him massively. He was off in France at that point, so he was living in exile in the royal court in France and could only look on powerlessly from the side as his father was being beheaded by his own parliament. So needless to say that that helped Charles II turn into the man that he would become. Extremely cynical, bit world-weary, and generally quite jaded, but also fairly cunning and willing to use whatever tricks he had at his arsenal. His father did not have those qualities. His father was extremely religious and very stubborn until the very end. Parliament actually tried to make him revoke many of his laws before they executed him. He just kept saying no at every turn. In the end, they saw no other way than to execute the king and take over themselves, which was unheard of, but Parliament had finally done it. And here was where he was executed. There would have been a balcony going straight out here, so he would have been marched from one end of the royal banqueting hall out to this balcony, stepped out on a scaffold, maybe about 10 meters high, black banners hanging down from it, and the crowd would have been around where we are. But it would have been a pretty unusual execution, because most executions were a rather raucous affair. Lots of people were screaming and shouting, either cheering for the person in question to be executed or protesting against it. Here, people kept silent. Why was that? Well, mainly because people were afraid. Because if you were seen cheering for the king's execution, you might have a royalist come and pay you a visit later. And if you were seen protesting against it, you might have a parliamentarian come after you. So it was a very tense political time with these two main factions that fought against each other. And wherever your sympathy might lie, the safest thing to do was just to keep quiet. And so most people did. But when he was beheaded, something strange actually occurred. People rushed over to the scaffold to try and catch drops of his blood on little napkins and pieces of cloth. The reason for this was twofold. One, this is before YouTube, Instagram, all these lovely technologies we have now. The only kind of souvenir you could have that could prove that you had been to an execution like this would be the king's blood. So people actually sold these napkins and bits of cloth in taverns and pubs and could sell them for a couple of pennies, even though it was probably their own nosebleed, who knows. But the second thing was that people believed the king's blood to have special properties. So people actually thought the mere touch of a king or a king's blessing or even their blood could cure you of all kinds of diseases, like ulcers. It could even cure cancer. So you actually had some people that immediately got drops of his blood and then started smearing them on their faces or their necks, wherever they might have swellings or other nasty stuff going on in them. So yeah, that's England in the 1600s, lovely place. So here we are right next to Oliver Cromwell's statue. Here he is, the man, the legend, the terror, the tyrant, the nemesis of Charles I and Charles II, who kept beating them on the battlefield and took over military control of the country. So he was definitely superior to both Charleses when it came to warfare, and even when Charles II tried to smooch up to the Scots and tried to get the Scots on his side, because when Charles I was beheaded, it horrified the Scots that the English had beheaded their own king. And so they declared Charles II to be their king and marched down on England. But, as you might have guessed, they were beaten by this guy, who forced and subjugated the Scots under his will and the Irish as well. No wonder that the Irish still don't like him to this day. Interestingly enough, he's standing right here. He's looking like a good Puritan because he's got a sword in one hand, representing his military might, and a Bible in the other, of course. His eye line is actually looking straight over at another bust of Charles I's head on the other side, which is quite funny. So if you follow his eye line, he will be staring at you menacingly if you happen to stand on the same side as Charles I. Now, he died, as you can see, in 1658 from natural causes. So neither king managed to get their revenge on him, and neither did the public, even though there was a general air of wanting to execute him towards the end of his reign. And it ended up being his own generals who actually formed the Royal Guards, that's the guys with the bearskin hats, quite a few of them at least, that turned the Royal Guards around to pave the way for Charles II to come back and take over the country, because the country was falling apart under the tyrannical yoke of the Puritans. And so Charles II was welcomed back with open arms in 1660 to take over. And since he was a worldly man, a political man, and not as stubborn as his father. He had the good sense to introduce the Declaration of Breda, where he forgave all the people that had conspired against his father before. Forgave almost all of them, except for the judges that had sentenced him to death. So there were a few people that were being hunted down, but otherwise most of Parliament and most of the gentlemen were forgiven by the king when he came back to take over the country. He realized he needed these political institutions if he wanted to rule with any legitimacy. And he came with a lot of continental influences. So actually, after his 9 years of exile in France, he brought a lot of French and also maybe a little bit of German, but mostly French fashions into the country. And he became the polar opposite of the Puritans. So Charles II came to represent everything that the Puritans were not. Funny, scandalous, open to sciences and art, and a cosmopolitan figure, which were the diametrical opposites of Puritan rule, which were insular and heavily religious and zealous and suspicious of anything that didn't fit into their creed. It's funny here where his statue is actually where his head was put on a spike. Because he couldn't be executed, because he was already dead, it was decided to hang and trial his corpse instead. So they actually exhumed him from Westminster Abbey, where he used to be buried, and then they put his corpse on trial before they hung him, beheaded him, put his head on a spike here, and paraded the rest of his corpse through town. So that was sort of the meager justice that the English could get for their 11 years of tyranny under the Puritans. That's why he was also called the man who died twice, incidentally, or the most reviled man in English history. Lovely title too. But he is here because he does represent the first time that Parliament dared to stand up to its own king, which had never happened before, but Parliament had gotten to a new stage in its power, which you might say that Cromwell personified. Coronated like his forefathers before him and like his descendants after him in Westminster Abbey. There was one slight hurdle though, because the parliamentarians had thought that the scepter and the orb would never have to be used again. England was now going to be a republic forevermore. They had actually melted it down. So they needed to fashion a new golden orb and scepter for Charles II. They did that in 1661. You know something, our Charles III, for his coronation, used that very orb and scepter, right? Same as Elizabeth II and all the others before them. So that's the current orb and scepter that the royal family is using to this day for their coronations. I want to share some quotes as well, because we've been talking a lot about various other figures, but I want to share some quotes about our Charles II, about our protagonist here today. Here is one of John Wilmot, 2nd Earl of Rochester, who writes of Charles, "Restless he rolls from whore to whore, a merry monarch, scandalous and poor." Right? And that was his reputation. He was known as, both when he was in exile in France, he went from one lady to another, and he did the same thing when he became king here. So that was part of the great tapestry of scandals going on in the Palace of Whitehall. And that is what the Stuarts are famous for to this day, for bringing festivity and partying back to the country and to the royal family. He was recorded to have at least 16 bastard children and 13 mistresses. And those are just the ones that are recorded. He probably had many, many more that we know nothing about. I'll just share another funny little quote with you on that note. There was a man who asked him how many women he had had. And Charles mischievously answered 39, explaining that the number of the articles of the Anglican faith was a good enough total for the head of the Church of England. Here's another quote of Charles II, which kind of encapsulates that. "I always admired virtue, but I could never imitate it." Tells you all you need to know about this king. It was also under him, however, that things like the Royal Society flourished. The Royal Society including the likes of Isaac Newton and Robert Boyle. So it was really under Charles II that arts and sciences gained a new revitalization. That's what the Restoration period is known for as well. And the first time that female actors became a thing. Before then it had always been male actors. Now women were starting to get into the profession as well. And quite a few of those actresses also, of course, ended up in Charles's bed. The most famous one of the most famous ones at least, being Nell Gwyn, who we've covered in another video. So the reason why he married his wife Catherine of Braganza, that we mentioned back in Green Park, was because the English crown was in dire need of money. And she came with a hefty dowry of 2 million crowns, which hit a sore spot for the royal treasury. Not only that, but she also came with the tantalizing prospect of owning Bombay and Tangiers. So very wealthy cities indeed that would help prop up the English economy. So it's more from an economic standpoint that he married her. Although he is reported to have written back to one of his friends reporting on her looks and saying, well, she's got pretty eyes and her voice is pleasing, so there's a few good features. Still, it was not a happy relationship and not a happy marriage, and she never got him a proper heir. Most of all their children actually died from miscarriages. So she had 3 miscarriages, and that resulted in, when he died very suddenly in his late 50s, he died of a stroke in the Palace of Whitehall. He had no legitimate heir, which proved another problem for the English crown and for the country. He had, however, raised a lot of his bastard children into nobility and turned them into dukes and duchesses left and right. So he had brought a whole new stock to the aristocracy, but he had left no heir, which left the country with his brother, James II, to take over instead. But he's a whole other story. Other monumental events that we won't have time to cover here, but he took part in repairing London after the Great Fire of London, 1666. One of the worst plagues London had in 1665, just before that. He was part of that as well. And he did try and rebuild large parts of London with Catherine throughout his whole reign. He was also part of the Popish plot, which was a scandal of mass hysteria that turned out to be nothing but propaganda. And don't forget to like and subscribe. Motherfucker.